Welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled, The Wisdom of Jesus. And it's for July the 19th, 2020, summer quarter, lesson number 7. And our text is taken from Mark, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 6. Now, a little background information. This lesson today takes place historically right after the healing of Jairus' daughter, and where Jesus goes back to his own hometown in Nazareth and begins to teach in his home synagogue. And this was quite common at this time period. People who were considered to be rabbis, teachers, when they would come into various synagogues, they would be asked to speak. And a lot of us who are ministers, that happens with us a lot of times. We'll go visit a particular church, and the pastor of the church will ask us to say a few words, or do you have any words of encouragement or testimony to share? And it's a great honor to do that. And so you do that. And they did the same kind of thing during this time period, where a visiting rabbi would come, and particularly in the situation where Jesus was in, where it was his hometown, it was where he was from, the people knew him. And so when he came to the synagogue, they, of course, had him do some speaking and asked him to talk a little bit. And these rabbis, it was kind of the time period where these Jewish teachers, these rabbis, would fall into several different classes of rabbis. There was the Pharisees, who followed the Pharisees, and the Pharisees' line of thought, and then the Sadducees, who followed the Sadducees' line of thought, and then the Essenes. And you pretty much will kind of classify them. You Pharisees were your real super strict people for the law, and paid a real particular attention to the minute little details to the law. The Sadducees would have been considered more of your liberal Bible teachers of the day, and then the Essenes were more or less like your Pentecostals, like us Pentecostals. They were given to a little bit of excitement in the way they approach things. And so that's how the rabbis more or less were grouped about. And the time period that Jesus lived in and that he was here on the earth was a unique time period for the Jewish people. Between the years of 6 and 41 AD, the Roman procurator, the governor, would pretty much assign and dictate who was going to be the high priest. And it was the spiritual leadership, the real true spiritual leadership of the time, was more or less being handled by the rabbis, the traveling preachers of the day, because the high priest and the Levitical group, they were in such control by the Roman government. They were in league with the government of the time. And any time that you have religion and politics mixed together, it contaminates both of them. I can't think of a time where political and and religious, spiritual, or actually just religious groups would merge together into one entity, where maybe a religious group would be heavily into politics, or a political group would be heavily into religion. I can't think of a time in the history of the world where that actually worked out okay. That almost always ends up with a lot of contamination like that. And that's what was happening during the time of Jesus, that Jesus was on the earth, where the Sanhedrin court and the high priest, that's the reason why they were so corrupt, because they were in league with the politics of the day. You know, in true spirituality, true Christianity needs to be completely separated from the things of the world. You know, and that's the way that Jesus approached his ministry. It's the way John the Baptist approached his ministry, the way the apostles approached their ministry, and even before John the Baptist and Jesus were the Essenes, and they approached spirituality that way, where they were more or less separated from the things of the world. You can't be friends with the world and be the friend of God, and you can't worship God and mammon. It just doesn't work out that way. So anyway, so that pretty much is the background. And also too, it's important for us to note that the Christian church took the model of the synagogue. They took it to heart. And so you see a lot of the very early Christian churches were modeled a lot after those first century synagogues. And, you know, by being a center for people to come for teaching, for fellowship, to be a means of helping those who are down and out in the community, because synagogues did a lot of that. The early churches did a lot of that. And the true churches now should be doing a lot of that. But anyway, Mark 6, verse 1 and 2, Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing?" Okay, now, as I said in the background information, that this was Jesus's hometown. This is where he grew up in. These people knew him. They had seen him as a child and seen how he had learned his craft. And they had a hard time accepting him as a teacher and as a miracle worker, because they kept remembering him as a child. And a lot of times you will see that happen when someone begins to mature and God calls them in the ministry, and they stand up and they begin to preach, and they preach with authority. And the people who knew them as a child, they keep thinking of them as a little bitty kid. And it is hard sometimes to get past some of that. You know, I mean, I've had people, you know, that had been in my Royal Ranger program that I had watched grow up, and people I have babysat, and I have sat and hear them speak. And sometimes you have to, you have to make a conscious effort to get past that, and to get past the fact that you knew this person when they were real little. Maybe you even changed their diaper. And it's difficult sometimes to get past that, but we have to get past that. Now, it's important for us too to notice in this scripture how that they were amazed at what he taught. Where did he get these things? And there's two aspects of this. Both of them are just as valid. One of them, as I was talking about, they remembered Jesus as a very young child and kept thinking of him as the person they knew as a young child. And the other part of this is that the things Jesus was saying were new and a different way of looking at things, and they were wondering where this came from, because they were used to, as I had mentioned in the background information, they were used to having rabbis who would come around teaching, and they would have the standard stock doctrine, teaching points, talking points of those three main groups: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And they would take the talking points of the particular group that they belonged to, and they would just be reiterating those talking points. And Jesus went way beyond any of those talking points, because he came down from the right hand of God the Father. And he has been from eternity to eternity. Throughout time everlasting, Jesus has been there. And he was there and an active participant in the creation of the universe. So when he spoke with authority, and they were not used to that. They had never heard anybody, and none of us have ever physically heard anybody who would be talking about Abraham or Moses and talking with authority as someone who actually spoke with them, had first-hand experience of speaking with Abraham. You remember the story in the Old Testament, how that Abraham was there in the cool of the day, and those three visitors came? Well, Jesus Christ, the pre-existent Christ, was one of them. And so Jesus came and spoke with Abraham and talked with him. And no one who had ever stood inside of a synagogue was in that same boat. So this was completely a different perspective that these people were hearing. To hear someone with that kind of authority. Mark 6, verse 3 and 4. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. Now, a couple things that I want to point out. First off is that when this story is told in the book of Matthew, Matthew points out a little bit different wording in what some of them were saying. Matthew 13:55, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? So Matthew notes that some of them were pointing out that not only was Jesus a carpenter, but he's the son of Joseph the carpenter. Now, an interesting thing that I didn't really stop to think about until recently. At church we were going through that book by Kathy Lee Gifford and Rabbi Jason Sobel, The Rock, the Road, and the Rabbi, which is a real good book. I want to highly recommend it. But Rabbi Sobel points out that carpenter is the way English people would have thought of that particular Greek and Hebrew word. But actually, the word itself really is more just a builder, and that more than likely Jesus and Joseph were actually stonemasons. Because if you stop and think about it, in the Holy Land, there isn't hardly any trees at all. And so there wouldn't be much call for someone working in wood. They'd be almost always working in stone because there are rocks everywhere. There are hardly no trees. So, and plus the word itself in both Hebrew and Greek isn't really specifically for working in wood. It's just being a builder, and so more than likely, that was Jesus's profession, and it's a big testimony to Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, how that he had stepped up to the plate and had fulfilled all of the duties that a father was to fulfill for a son. In ancient times, in the Jewish culture, a father had four main responsibilities toward his son: to circumcise him, to redeem him, to teach him the law, and to teach him a trade. In fact, they had an old saying, he who teaches not his son to do some work is as he is taught him robbery. And that is, as I said, that is a testimony to Joseph, how he stepped up to the plate. And God bless men who will do that. My father that raised me, that taught me to be a man, that taught me to have integrity, that taught me to work, that taught me to pay my bills, that taught me to take care of my family. My dad that raised me we have absolutely no genes, no chromosomes in common. When he asked my mama to marry him, he told me, I was 5 years old, he said, this is a package deal. When I marry your mama, you are part of it, and from that point on, you're going to be my son. And he didn't look back. He never reneged on any of it. He absolutely stepped up to the plate. And I'm here to tell you, I am saved because of the Lord Jesus Christ, but I'm a man because of my dad, because he taught me how to be a man. And God bless the people who will step up to the plate, the men who will step up to the plate and raise a child that is genetically not any kin to them will raise them as themselves. God bless men who are man enough to do that. But we see here how that, again, let me just reiterate that. We see here how Joseph did that. And he taught Jesus that craft. We also too see how that Jesus had half brothers and sisters there. Now there's a little bit of contention, differences of opinion of some folks that believe, the Catholics being one of them, that Mary, that Jesus was the only child of Mary's. That the brothers and sisters were actually Joseph's by a previous marriage. You know, I don't see any good strong evidence of that in the Bible. Just because of the way the wording is and that kind of thing. When it's talking about James, who wrote the book of James, and then Jude, who wrote the book of Jude. So you got two epistles in the New Testament were written by Jesus' half-brothers. And James actually had a very prominent position in the early church. So, but I don't see any strong evidence or any real evidence at all of these siblings of Jesus that are mentioned here being only Joseph's children. You know, and it would have probably been mentioned in the text if that were the case. The only thing that might possibly give a little credence to that is the fact that at the cross, when Jesus looked down at John the Apostle and gave John the Apostle the charge of taking care of his mother. But you can also, too, if you look real carefully at some of the wording of right after the resurrection, the women who went to the tomb and stuff, if you look real closely, it appears that John the Apostle was actually Jesus' cousin. And so Mary appears to be his aunt, which would have been a very logical thing to give the charge to a nephew to take care of his aunt. And plus the fact that Jesus' brothers were not there at the cross. And Jesus looked down, and there was John. So John was there, and that's who he gave the charge to take care of his mama. Okay? Mark 6, 5 and 6. He could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Now, I think it's important for us to stop and consider this a little bit. What the Bible is saying here is not that Jesus lacked the power to do any great works. It's just that they lacked the heart to receive it. See, God doesn't ever lose his power. But if we harden our hearts and we don't have any faith, we block God and prohibit some of the miracles from happening because we don't have the proper mindset, the proper faith, the proper hope, the proper attitude. And we are blocking God from doing a great move. And that's what this verse is saying. And if we don't take anything else from this Sunday school lesson, it's critical that we get this from this Sunday school lesson. That if we don't have the right attitude and we don't listen and have faith and trust in God, that we can block a great move of God, just as these people did. They were in the perfect position to see mighty miracles, great salvation, great hope, great changes in their attitude if they had just looked past their natural lack of faith and began to put their eyes on the things above and put their hope and trust in God and be receptive of the truth that was being preached to them. These people could have seen a phenomenal move of God. People resurrected and raised from the dead and lives changed and healings and complete total turnaround in people's lives. They could have experienced that. All they had to do is have the faith to accept it. And they would not do it because of lack of faith. How many times over the last 63 years have I missed the mark and have not received from God because of that doubt, that lack of faith, that lack of trust that is in my heart? It grieves me to stop and think of my own failings, my own lack of trust, my own lack of faith that has blocked God from doing the things that He would like to do in my life, the life of my family, the life of my community, the life of my church, to where I just didn't have the faith to listen and believe God. We can completely nullify a move of God by that lack of faith. And that's what these people did. The problem's not in God. God's got the power. The question is, do we have the faith? A couple of concluding thoughts here. Just want to reiterate a couple of things. First off, now let's look at the example, the practical example here of people that we've watched grow up, that we know so very well. And when they say and are doing things that are spiritual and they are called out, we need to be receptive of what they say and look past watching them grow up. The other thing too, as I said, the lack of faith can put a block on what God wants to do in our lives. And we need to believe and trust God. Okay? Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.